We all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us. Are you a man or a slave?
Months continue to roll on with no progress. The lockdowns continue and schools remain closed. But in the beginning of August, the west coast of the United States began its annual wildfire season. A season which will go down in the history books as one of the most devastating fire seasons on record. It began in California, when a gender reveal party, using fireworks, set the initial blaze. This soon exploded into multiple fires across the state. Video from the affected areas are unbelievable and look as if it came out of a Hollywood blockbuster. As August drew to a close, the fires begin to spread to Oregon and Washington, causing the air quality to plummet past that of China. Satellite footage, stitched together, showed how much smoke had entered the upper atmosphere. It blanketed neighboring states and forced any prospect of ending the lockdowns to be deferred until the fires calmed down. The cause of this event is still being debated, with one side of the argument claiming it's the fault of climate change, while the other side gives a more nuanced explanation. While climate change is a contributing factor in the growth of unchecked wildfires, it is not the immediate cause. Being used as a catch-all for any natural disaster, climate change has become a blanket excuse for the agencies and organizations responsible for these areas. One such alternative cause for these fires is the mismanagement of forest lands and the practices used in managing fire risks. For example, the State Department of Natural Resources, the agency responsible for much of the wildland firefighting in Washington, enforces a strict set of rules aimed at keeping smoke from drifting into communities, effectively limiting the scope of controlled burns sought by the Forest Service and others. Meanwhile, DNR has stopped conducting burns on its own forest lands. DNR and its burn rules are the responsibility of elected State Public Lands Commissioner Peter Goldmark. Goldmark has been a high-profile advocate of thinning millions of acres of dangerously crowded and unhealthy western forests. He has publicly chastised federal and state lawmakers for shortchanging forest health budgets. But Goldmark views chainsaws and other equipment as the first tools of choice for thinning the woodlands. In an interview with the Seattle Times, Goldmark said DNR is open to considering policy changes allowing more controlled burns. But he expressed little enthusiasm for leading the charge, pointing to blowback his agency gets when smoke drifts into towns. He said the issue hasn't been raised to him by Forest Service leaders, and called it a little disingenuous of those who haven't borne the wrath of smoked-out folks to criticize his agency's approach. Currently, DNR conducts limited burning of slash piles in meadows, but does no prescribed burns on the lands it manages, a departure from agency practice in previous decades. Goldmark is also wary of giving the green light to large burns on Washington's 9 million acres of Forest Service lands. He questions whether burns can be safely conducted in forests that have not first been logged or thinned. In the rugged Klamath region, along the California-Oregon border, a group called the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership says the Forest Service is blocking prescribed burns that are needed to keep the area safe. They're doubling down on a suppression strategy that's been catastrophic, said Will Harling, a director of Western Klamath. The organization says the Forest Service rejected a proposed forest treatment that could have reduced the severity of the Slater fire, which burned 157,000 acres in the Klamath. 2020 was especially challenging. COVID-19 protocols interfered with some burns. Other burns got postponed because the relentless wildfire season continued well into December, effectively depleting the agency's crews. Scientists say the West's record on both types is dismal. By contrast, the mega landowner of the West, the Forest Service, conducted prescribed fires on just 167,000 acres in the West last year, according to data supplied by the agency. That's just a sliver of the 80 million acres the agency manages in California, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and other western states. In California, the Forest Service oversaw burns on 44,000 acres in 2020. With other agencies thrown in, the total amount of land deliberately burned in California averages 125,000 acres a year, according to the California Air Resources Board. Still, that's small compared to the 33 million acres of California forest and 15 million acres of flammable grassland and chaparral. In the Forest Service jurisdictions that cover Idaho, prescribed fires were conducted on 34,000 acres, a figure that includes some burns in Washington, Montana, and the Dakotas. The agency manages 20 million acres in Idaho. More than 4.9 million acres of national forests burned in 2020. It was the most since 1910, a year seared into the Forest Service's history. That year, the Great Fire devoured 3 million acres in Montana, Idaho, and eastern Washington, killed 85 people, and sent smoke billowing as far away as New England. The Forest Service, just 5 years old, took it to heart. Fire was once a natural part of the landscape. As many as 4 million acres burned a year in California before European settlers arrived. But after the Great Fire, the Forest Service and its first director, Gifford Pinchot, adopted a suppression culture that called for extinguishing all fires. Critics say this left forests badly overgrown and susceptible to disaster. It wasn't until a pioneering UC Berkeley professor named Harold Biswell began experimenting with prescribed fires in the 1950s and 1960s that the Forest Service began to see the light. For so many years, the culture was that fire is bad and all fire needs to be put out, said Theodore Peterson, a Forest Service fuels specialist in Idaho. Last August, the chief of the Forest Service, Vicki Christiansen, signed a memorandum of understanding with California Governor Gavin Newsom, pledging to double the volume of forest treatments in the state to 1 million acres a year through thinning and burning. The document is non-binding. Newsom wants the legislature to appropriate $1 billion over the next few years to pay for California's share of the agreement, but it's unclear how much the feds will spend. Forest scientists have concluded that these prescribed fires can make forests less prone to disease and benefit wildlife. But with Democratic leaders refusing to take responsibility while continuing to blame climate change, it is unclear if any improvements will be made. We can only hope our political leaders have the courage to stop capitulating radical activists and finally listen to the Native American tribes and forest scientists who know better. The statistics surrounding the pandemic expose the manufactured nature of this event. The mainstream corporate media have convinced the public at large to shut down their lives over a virus that's lived with us for millennia. For starters, the death rate reported by the CDC is under 6% for the most vulnerable of the population, 70+ years of age. To make matters worse, late last year people began to notice that Australia had not reported a single case of influenza since July, something never seen in its history. The numbers we have been told over the past year have been either a lie or an imaginative stretch. According to the CDC, only 6% of the 161,392 deaths recorded actually died solely from COVID. That's 9,683 deaths from COVID only. The other 94% had 2 to 3 other serious illnesses contributing to death, to which most of those were of advanced age. First, the CDC released new guidelines saying there was no need for asymptomatic people to get tested if they were otherwise young and healthy. That's even if you were exposed to someone who had tested positive for the virus. The CDC put up on their official website the following details for people who have COVID symptoms. If you have symptoms of COVID-19 and want to get tested, call your healthcare provider first. Most people will have mild illness and can recover at home without medical care and may not need to be tested. It seems the CDC then began telling us to treat it as any other illness, the flu for example. For 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned. For deaths with conditions or causes in addition to COVID-19, on average, there were 2.6 additional conditions or causes per death. Among the mountain of evidence now, this simple fact is what many have been trying to tell people for months. 94% of people are dying with COVID, for the CDC, not because of it. In fact, they are dying with COVID and an average of 2.6 additional conditions or causes of death. To further add to the confusion, the average age of death due to the virus is over the average age of death overall. Meanwhile, the people who are dying in excess numbers from something other than COVID due to our lockdowns are much younger. These are much younger people dying of suicides, drug overdoses, from declining to seek medical care for fear of COVID. Outside of nursing homes, which comprise nearly half of our deaths in this country despite only having 0.6% of our population. We shut down the planet to protect the most vulnerable. Yet the deaths of younger people from other causes are actually costing us more years of life than the years of life we are protecting. And this doesn't even count all the disastrous impacts from children being kept out of school for months at a time. Now that the vaccine has been released to the public, the numbers, which were already exaggerated, have dropped significantly. Even with the inflated statistics, the rates at which people were dying and the amount of people who contracted COVID are not justification for the lockdowns or authoritarian measures taken by world governments. Numbers will be sought to explain the world around us. What does it mean to say that the present crisis is somehow twice as bad as that of 2008? That a fifth of the country is out of work? That the only industry now hiring is debt collection? How are we to respond to predictions that over 100,000 Americans may die from what sociologists call deaths of despair? How can we even begin to make sense of the fact that the consequences of 8 months will be with us for 5 times that many years? That a child born today will be a teenager before we return to anything that resembles even externally the precarious equilibrium to which we had been accustomed in January. Was all of this inevitable? It is always possible to insist that we should seek another way, a path of shared work, shared purpose, and shared wealth, as our great-grandparents did long ago. But this is naive. Trends that were worrisome long before we had heard of the new virus are accelerating to a point at which they are probably irreversible. A political system that during what we told ourselves were ordinary times could not solve the simplest of challenges will not rise to the present occasion. Instead, Americans will muddle on, looking after ourselves and our families and friends as best we can, helpless in the face of transformations that we will barely notice.